welcome to Beginnings, a series of interviews focused on the birth of playback theatre in Australia and New Zealand. I'm Michael Pooley, and this is the full interview with Mary Good, who, as you'll hear, was a pioneer of playback and was, perhaps, the first playback apprentice. Mary was a founding member of both the Sydney Company and the Melbourne Company, and has been active as a teacher and mentor of playback practitioners for 40 years. As you'll hear, Mary spent a month in New Paltz in 1981 with the original company, and in the process helped form approaches that have become integral to the way that playback developed. I've known of Mary Good all my playback life, but this was the first time I met her. I had a wonderful morning with her in her home in Melbourne on the 28th of October 2019. In each of these interviews there's various background noises. In this one you'll hear a leaf blower, garden shears and a plane. As always, just ignore those and enjoy Mary's reflections. If you can introduce yourself and what that initial contact with playback was.
Yeah, my name's Mary Good, and I think it was before I went to Drama Action Centre. So I met this man, Jonathan Steiner from New York. I think that was his surname. And he told me about Jonathan Fox, so I wrote to Jonathan and got a lovely letter back. And then I spoke to Phil Bowers, and Phil Bowers went and saw the work, which was more than I had done.
He went over to New York.
Yeah. And then I finished my year at Drama Action Centre, and I went over to New York for a month. Now I can't remember, March, April, can't remember. And just sort of shadowed the company around, watching them, joining in their performances. Not occasionally I acted, but mostly I didn't. I just, was soaking it all in, really. But I learnt a heap from just being around and read a lot and, talked to different people and, all of that. And I did some interviews with people, don't know what's happened to them, and came back. And then at the end of that year, Peter and I started working on developing a company, and it was really because Bridget and Francis, who were the obvious people to do it, were tied up with running Drama Action Centre. My background was as a psychologist and psychotherapist. And then at the end of that year I came back to Melbourne and started the Melbourne Company in 1982, I think, 82?
No, 81, I think. 81? No, 82. Okay, 82. All right. So let me go back a little. So your first actual contact was when Jonathan and Joe came to Sydney to do the workshops?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it was to Melbourne, actually, they came.
Yes, they came to Melbourne, right. So you did some workshops with them in
Melbourne and then in Sydney.
Okay. So you were in Drama Action at that time. Okay. And do you have any memory of those initial workshops? What it felt like being involved in those workshops with them?
Well, I remember that it was exciting, and also that it was very, very contained. So there was a sense of, I remember one girl young woman told a story about having been deaf for most of her life and then having some implant which gave her, she could hear again, she could hear for the first time, and how terrible it was and how extraordinarily distressing it was to have all of these sounds coming at her that she could make no sense of, and how terrifying it was. And I just remember how well that story was contained and she was contained, and there was a lot. So that's one strong memory. I think that was at the Melbourne workshop. Yeah.
Right. I'm just wondering whether there was anything in particular about playback itself that attracted you. You talked about the way the stories were held.
Well, I think that's what it's about for me, is it's something about, I think I have to talk about myself now rather than then, because for me now it's about trying to find the community story and really trying to be very thoughtful about who is the next storyteller and how you deal with that, so that you don't have people just putting their hand up because they've got a story like the last one. And I think that's a really interesting thing, is to see what is really going on in this community that is gathered here and what's really happening here. So that really interests me, is to get the story of the community out.
Yes.
At the time, probably I was more interested in, just in people's stories and having them honoured.
So those workshops would have been, I imagine, bringing together a whole disparate group around a completely new form.
Absolutely,
Right.
absolutely. So there were people from the acting world, there were people from, the therapy world. There was a whole range of people.
Yeah. My understanding is in Sydney, I'm not sure whether in Melbourne as well, following the workshop there was a public performance.
That's right.
In Melbourne and in Sydney? Yeah. And
there may be more than one. Well,
right.
I remember the Sydney one because that was at the Nimrod Theatre.
It was,
And I remember the Melbourne one was at Melbourne State College, which had a very good theatre.
Okay. And do you remember anything of those? Because were you in...
I was in both of them.
Both of them. I mean, just even a sense of what it was like to be involved.
Yeah. I remember feeling out of my depth at times in it and not quite having a sense of how to... in one stage I think I was a child who just asked a lot of questions and I didn't quite know how to bring that in. At the time I didn't have a clue how to do it.
Yes, I imagine it must have, because I'm not sure about the Melbourne performance, but Sydney was a big audience.
Well, that was the Sydney one.
Right, okay.
The Melbourne one was big too.
Yeah.
And all I remember is there was a story about a woman called Marika and her chooks, but I can't remember. It was pretty out there, but I don't remember.
Peter's memory is that he had a memory that there was a walk up in the Ku-ring-gai National Park where there was a conversation, felt you were there, and Bridget and Francis, about forming a Sydney company. Do you have any...
I remember the Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park, but I don't remember the conversation.
Right, okay.
I think Jonathan and Joe were there, so I think we must have had a conversation with them.
Yes.
There.
Yes, that's his memory.
Right.
And he says they were very open to that happening.
They were incredibly supportive. Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
He remembers then a series of auditions. Do you remember anything of that?
I just remember that we did them. I don't remember the details.
Okay. Yeah. And do you have a memory of Jonathan and Joe from that, how they were at that time?
Well, just how, say Joe was very precise about detail and things. And so for the Melbourne performance, and maybe for the Sydney one too, we made the costumes. And we went out to a place in Surrey Hill, someone's house, and stitched away. So Jo was about getting everything looking, she was about more than this, but she was also about getting things looking good. Jonathan was very much more about shepherding, really, and holding the group together and talking to people about their anxieties or whatever.
And that invitation to Sydney, at least, was kind of drama action or connected through drama action.
They joined with Phil Boas in bringing them out.
Right.
That's right.
Yes.
So Phil Boas probably was mainly responsible for the Melbourne performance and Bridget and Francis for the Sydney one.
Okay. Because you were at drama action at that time.
Yeah.
Did it feel like it was a good fit in doing in drama action? And they've come and done some workshops. Suddenly there is a company in Sydney.
Starting. Yeah.
Do you have any memory of what that was like, those early...
Well, look, one of the things that I remember about it, which was really funny, was there was a guy, anyway, he designed the costumes. We wore green surgeon's gowns, really.
Oh, right.
They were shockers. I don't know whether Peter mentioned those, but...
I can't remember whether he did or not. What I do know, I know people have talked about costumes.
Yes.
And discussions about costumes continue to this day.
Right.
So it's still an alive issue in the Sydney company to this day.
Yeah. Well, I think in Melbourne we at some point just decided on black.
And that was the case in Sydney for a long time. Probably 2 years ago we started exploring something different.
Right.
And anyway, that's a whole other story. Do you have any recollections or memories from... that early period of kind of bringing together a company and people working together, over what potentially could be a fair time, what that was like?
I don't really. See, I think I would have known that I was leaving and going to America, so I probably wasn't although I was keen to get the company started, I wasn't as invested as other people were.
Okay. And the initial Sydney performances?
I can remember where it was. I can remember some church hall in
Paddington?
Yeah,
Yes.
I was going to say Darlinghurst, but Paddington. I don't remember much about that performance at all.
No. But you must have been taken by it pretty considerably to then go to
New York. Yeah, I was. It felt like sort of the logical thing to add to Drama Action Centre for me.
In which way?
Well, I suppose psychologically and, community-wise. And, one of the things that Jonathan was really strong on, or I thought he was, I don't know whether he was or not, was that anything, like the smallest thing can be a story. And that really, I really took that to heart. And that was a beautiful thing, really, because someone could say something very small and it could be honoured. So the audience didn't have to do anything out of the ordinary, really. Well, they did in that they had to speak up, but, they weren't asked to be anything other than themselves.
And what was that time like in New York?
Oh, it was great. It was great. Because they lived in country, they lived in Newports, which is a little university town, and the Playback members were in that area, so we'd go to different people's places and different performances in different places, and Jonathan would make sure I had things to read, and I think he was quite organised. I think he had, a little program set up for me.
So you had contacted them and said, can I come and do this? And they were obviously open to it.
Because I stayed with them.
Oh, okay.
As well.
Yeah.
I remember one thing about that. Jo went to London for a week or something as part of the, what she was doing.
Yes.
And I was in their kitchen, so they were all out and Jo was away. And I was just really hungry, and I reached over and there was a tin of nuts, and I opened the tin of nuts and it was I don't know, it was that sort of thing of feeling slightly guilty because I was eating their nuts anyway.
And you got the surprise of your shock of your life. So how long did you have there at that time? A month. And did it feel like it was a good opportunity to ground in?
Yeah, it did. It did. And as I said, I did some interviews with people on their board and, different people. So I talked to people about, what they thought it was about and what was interesting to them. So it wasn't just going to rehearsals.
No,
it was,
you were immersing yourself.
Yeah.
And what was the sense of the company at that stage over there?
Well, it's a bit hard to remember, but they were sort of slightly a folksy company, But I think their acting was quite good. And they had a couple of really good actors, Michael, who died ages ago now, and Judy, and there were others, of course, but I don't remember.
So when you say folksy...
Oh, have you met Jonathan?
I have.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yes.
He's a bit folksy.
Yes. Because I guess they were still exploring to some extent
very much,
as well.
Very much.
Yeah.
I can't remember how old their company was, but it wasn't.
No, well, it must have only been 5 or 6 years.
Yeah. Maybe a bit more, but not a lot.
And so then you came back to Melbourne?
Yes. Well, did I? I think I did. Yeah, then I came back to... That's right. Then I came back to Melbourne and I advertised some workshops in Playback Theatre and ran them, and we decided to start a company.
And so was it easy to find people to come to the workshops?
Yeah.
Right.
Look, it was a time in Melbourne when people loved things like that. Like, I ran drama workshops for a few years and people just loved them. I think it was sort of, it was the early 80s. I don't know what that means in terms of what was happening in the world, but there was a sort of hunger for that sort of thing. And a lot of people who'd been through university and were working in hospitals or, they just loved coming.
Certainly, I know Jonathan has spoken about a sense, and I'm not sure I've got this exactly right, but that the community sense was stronger here than he felt was the case in the States.
Oh, really?
And that was an important, things really sort of solidified here in a way as Playback grew.
Yeah.
But
Well, probably like in Sydney, they would have had Drama Action Centre, and in Melbourne, I ran workshops, and we had weekly rehearsals, but we also invited people to come and run workshops for us. So Bridget and Francis and Jonathan and different people came and ran workshops for us. So there was a sense of, professional growth and integrity and all of that. And the Melbourne company was quite strong at that point. Yeah.
So that impetus to start a company in Melbourne, was that a difficult thing to do?
No. Look, it's really funny. I look back and I think, it might have been, but it didn't feel difficult.
Right. And do you
I think it was the time. It was easy. And I managed to get this fantastic studio, which I shared with a guy who taught Tai Chi. And so for a really reasonable rent, we had a space. We used to perform there and rehearse there and,
Do you have memories of that time, that early company, those early performances?
Yeah. I have one particular memory. It was a story of someone who had a boyfriend who was Norwegian, I think, and he went climbing in the mountains and they never found him. But the way the story was done was, absolutely fantastic. Like without proper lighting or anything, somehow they managed to get that experience of being lost in a haze and just disappearing. It was one of those performances where you go.
And was that early company, the people that came to that, were they predominantly from the theatre world or broadly the therapy world, or was it a mix? Or
they wouldn't have been from the theatre world, but they would have been like people who were interested in theatre.
Yes, of course.
Yes, but probably mostly they were sort of. Look, I can't really answer it, but there would have been people. There would have been people from the therapy world, but that wasn't what I'm sort of remembering. I'm remembering it as broader than that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned earlier the sense of Playback's ability to hold any story and the sense of community building. As you then enmeshed in a company and starting a company, were there other aspects of it did that stay at the core, or were there other things emerge? How did Playback?
Always other things emerging. Like there was the acting or there was the music. First of all, we had the most brilliant musician. She was a cellist and she was very proper, very respectful, and she was German, I think, and she would come up with the most stunning music. She would carry quite a lot. She was wonderful.
Do you remember it as a fairly smooth time company-wise, or was it turbulent?
It was a bit of both. I can't remember when, but towards the end of my time, we perhaps let some wrong people in, and I think that created some real difficulties. And when I left, and when I say it now, I think, well, that's probably why I left, although it wasn't conscious. But I feel like they sucked a lot of the life out of things. And when I left, the challenges to the next person were awful. And I think it wasn't long after that they stopped having a director and started becoming more of a communal.
So that process of auditioning and bringing in people is certainly challenging.
And sort of being able to recognise someone's destructiveness is just so important. Yeah.
And to communicate to people what's really involved in being in a company.
Yes.
Before you bring them in, giving them that sense of what's required.
Well, a lot of people in the early years would apply to come in because they've been coming to performances and loved the work.
And do you have a sense or memory of was there much contact between companies, Sydney and Melbourne, or other companies at that stage?
I remember the Sydney company coming down to Melbourne. There was a little bit. There was a bit, yeah. And we had little mini conferences, and I went to Perth and worked with, because Perth started fairly soon too after all that. I started working with Perth, and I did some work in New Zealand too, but I can't remember. So Marilyn and Martin were very strong on the beginnings of Playback in Auckland.
And was there a connection there with Drama Action, or was
yes,
there a...
Yes, they did Drama Action the year after I did it.
Okay,
yeah.
okay. Do you have any knowledge of, because Jonathan and Joe went to New Zealand on the way, I understand.
Yes.
Do you know who was connected to that part of that trip?
Well, Marilyn and Martin and Bev.
Okay.
Bev.
Right.
I don't know who else.
Yeah.
But Bev would probably remember. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So they're really the main questions that I had.
Right.
It would be interesting, though, if you have any other just general reflections around what that connection over those many years has been for you and meant for you.
Well, I think that, I can't imagine doing it now, but I know I loved it. It was really a passion, and I loved, thinking about what would be a good warm-up to this and what would, I loved thinking about that and doing that, and, I loved some of the silliness that we got involved in, and, it was just fun. And it wasn't all fun, of course, but, when you hit depths, it's not fun, but it's invigorating, yes. And I remember doing some really difficult performances, like there's one for people who'd been retrenched by the army or something like that. And there were all of these really, really angry people. And this man sort of, I don't know, he just went too far. He went just right over the top, sort of abusing me. I felt like this little thing. And I can't remember what I did in response. But from then on, the whole thing turned around. Like everyone else in the audience saw what happened and realised that it was not on, and then they started to tell stories.
Oh, wow.
It was great. It was fantastic. And I remember another performance, it was maybe university staff or something, but nothing seemed to be moving, nothing was happening. So I just challenged them on it. And that's probably the first time I challenged a whole group of people on not doing something. And that was a fantastic moment, yeah. So I remember, those little steps along the way where
And it must have been quite challenging. I mean, in Sydney generally, not always the case, but people are in the company for a long time before they step into the conductor role. You would have been into a conductor role
straight away. I can't say I did it well.
Oh, well.
Not right at the beginning.
No, none of us do. And do you have again, you've mentioned that sort of honouring of the story. Anything else around what playback is that allows it to work in those situations?
Well, honouring, mirroring is another word, of course, and the importance of mirroring in the world. I think the most basic thing, is we are all people with ordinary lives and with many experiences, and some which are the same as others and some which are very different and all of that. And somehow playback, the stories come from the audience, and if you're lucky and if you can work well with the audience, they're actually quite spontaneous. They're not prepared. I mean, obviously some are, but there is something about the organic nature of it that I think is different to anything else I've experienced, and I think that is really important. When I said Jonathan was folksy, I mean, that's another way of thinking about him, really, is he's looking for the organic nature of something.
Okay. Well, thank you. Any other reflections or anything to add?
No, this is quite different, but there's a group in India at a place called Jivika, which is an anti-slavery organisation, and we've done quite a bit of work there. And, the performances might not be brilliant and, all of that, but they go out every week and work in communities where there are people who are enslaved. And, I just think their commitment, like they've got I don't know how many, I might be exaggerating if I said 6, but about that many teams that go out into the community and work constantly with what they call Dalit colonies. So they're the sort of people who were called untouchables, and they have to live together because no one else will live with, And, I just think the work they are doing is exceptional, even if it's may not be, up there, but it'll be, but I think they're not going to the conference because they can't afford to, which is tragic, because I think they're making a real contribution to the work.
At that community and social level, at a way.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I know individual Australians have done similar work, but probably companies haven't done much of that.
No, I think that's an extraordinary development. And if you could get in touch with Kieran, he's probably got something written about what they're doing.
So you're still connected a bit?
Mainly through Bev, but we've made some really good friends over the years. So Christy will be one of the people that you'll meet in India who's been really central to the growth of Playback in India. But I don't know whether you want to go that far or...
Well, it's really that, I guess, just because it's 40 years next year, we've focused on the beginning. I may come back and talk about other things. But thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. And we're certainly aware you're very much a part of that beginning phase, those initial trips and that first company and first performances. So thank you. That was an interview with Mary Good, founding member of both the Sydney and Melbourne Playback companies. I feel very privileged to have had this time with Mary. She'd been dealing with a long-term illness, and yet she was so gracious and generous with her time. She died early in 2020, and so unfortunately I won't have the opportunity to speak to her about that groundbreaking work she did in India. At Bev Hosking's invitation, I had the opportunity after the IPTN conference in Bangalore to work with her at Jivika, the organisation that works with bonded labourers that Mary spoke about, and she's held with great love by many there. Mary spoke of the power of Playback to speak the story of the community, and it was wonderful to see that so strongly in action at Jivika. You can hear the full interviews with others who were instrumental in the founding of Sydney Playback at its website, playbacktheatre.com.au. Click on the menu and then enter history in the search bar at the bottom of the page. Each of the interviews has more than I was able to include in the edited video version and are worth a listen. Please email me at michael.pooley@iinet.net.au if you have memories, photos or stories to share about Sydney Playback at any stage of its 40-year history. We'd love to have those for our archive. Thanks for listening.